Okay, uh, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Uh, Dietmar Wolfram. Dr. Wolfram is a professor and senior associate dean at the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research interests include applied bibliometrics, informetrics, and scholarly communication, as well as information retrieval systems design and evaluation, and user studies. Among the many funders of his work uh, are the U.S. Department of Education, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, Thomson Reuters, and IMLS. Professor Wolfram's publications have appeared in the IEEE Computer Information Processing and Management, the Journal of Documentation, the Journal of Information Science, the Journal of Informetrics, and the list goes on. I could probably spend too much of his time talking about the list. He's a recipient of the Association for Information Science and Technology Clarivate Analytics Outstanding Information Science Teacher Award. He's a past president of the Association for Library and Information Science Education. He currently serves as the specialty chief editor for Frontiers in Research Metrics and Analytics Scholarly Communication. And on a personal note, I can't possibly be more excited to have someone talk about research on open science and particularly open peer review. And his work is excellent. I've been reading his papers, and oh boy, does he have cool findings. So please all join me in welcoming on Zoom Dr. Wolfram.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that wonderful introduction. I greatly appreciate it. I am sorry I cannot join you in person for this presentation, but I guess we know what we're dealing with these days, and I think we've gotten accustomed to dealing with Zoom. So hopefully this will be a satisfactory substitute for that. Let me first share my screen so that I can bring up my presentation. And let me just make sure I am sharing the correct screen. Can everyone see this? Excellent. Well, let's begin. What I'd like to present to you on today is really a series of projects I've been involved with over the last 5 years or so that deal with different aspects of the open science principles. And the research I've been looking at really relates to scholarly communication and how open science practices impact those different areas. So as an overview, the way I will structure this presentation is I will talk a bit about the open science movement, which has been now with us for a few decades, and it continues to be, I think it's being more broadly embraced beyond the biomedical sciences, where really a lot of it began. And the areas of open science that I would like to focus on in this presentation have to do with peer review and how it's addressed in open science, and ideas behind data sharing, the reuse of data, and the appropriate attribution of that data, or what we call data citation. And then I will wrap up with some implications that arise from the research that I've been looking at. So first of all, what is open science? And you may hear it also referred to as open scholarship, because when we talk about these open principles, they really can apply across the board. Now we can think of science in more the German term, where it covers a lot of, essentially all areas of human knowledge. But you may also hear the term open scholarship used, because these principles also apply in the humanities. So what is the motivation behind open science, and why do we need it? Well, the process of scholarly investigation, to the outsider, it's largely hidden. It's a black box where all they see is the outcome of the research process. And one of the initiatives behind Open Science is really to make the process of research discovery much more transparent and the researchers more accountable for what they do during their research projects. And this applies really across all stages of the research process. And there is also the larger social benefit that comes from sharing new knowledge and making it available to society as a whole, so that it's not locked behind paywalls and that society in general can benefit from it. The current status of open science, well, it is fairly broadly adopted in, as I mentioned, biomedical fields, and we're seeing it, these ideas also being embraced more widely in social sciences. And we see this in areas like funding agencies. Here in the US, that there are mandates now to engage in open practices, to make one's research openly available, to make one's data sets available to others. And some of these aspects are well established. In library and information science, we're very familiar with the idea of open access of publications, whether we're talking about green open access, gold open access, and other varieties. But there are other aspects of this open science movement that aren't as widely practiced in some or many disciplines. And this includes the idea of open data and data attribution, and the idea of open peer review of research. Open science has many different facets to it. And I found this diagram from the Foster Project in Europe to be quite helpful in understanding some of the different areas of open science. So as I mentioned, this process really involves opening up all aspects of research, from the beginning stages all the way to the end and final publication. So some of the different areas of open science include the idea of open notebooks. So the notes that researchers take while they're engaging in their research, this is made available in the interest of transparency. And the two areas that I'll be talking about, open data and open peer review. This then results in open access of content or the products of research. But related to this is also the idea of open source. So software that has been developed for research projects, making the source code available to others so that other researchers can either use that same source code or they can modify it to meet their own specific needs. Involving scientists more in social networks so that they can disseminate their findings. And then to the broad public, involving them in citizen science so that they can also contribute to discovery. And then open educational resources. So the ideas, these ideas translate to the idea of education, where what we learn from research can also then have applications in educational settings and making those resources available to others. So as I mentioned, the two areas that I am going to talk about relate to projects I've been involved with over the past several years. One is the area of open peer review. And the general idea behind this, this aspect of open science is that the identities of the reviewers who are reviewing manuscripts, whether it's journal manuscripts or conference papers, that their identities are known to the authors, and that the reports that they provide or their assessments of the research that they are reviewing also becomes public. So, and as you'll see, OPR can involve a combination of these ideas. In some cases, reviewers are identified, but their reviews are not. In other cases, the reviewers remain anonymous, but their review reports appear alongside the published papers. And then for open data, this is where the data that we generate as part of the research process, we make this publicly available so that others may benefit from it, or they can verify the findings that we publish. And one of the issues that is related to open data that we are still struggling with is the idea of providing appropriate credit or attribution to the data sharers. When you publish data, it's like publishing an article. But frequently, when data is made available, the attribution to those who have shared the data is either invisible or non-existent. And that's something that I think needs to change. Okay, so moving on to the first area, which is open peer review. As I mentioned, this topic actually isn't all that new, but it's only been gathering some momentum, I guess, in the last few years, as you'll see from my research findings. Before we talk about open peer review, let's review why we actually need peer review in general. And this is a process that has existed for centuries, where we want to ensure the quality and validity of the research that is being published. And to do this, we provide our research products to our peers. They then assess the merits of what we have researched, and they determine whether this is worthy of publication and where there is room for improvement. Now, the two standard forms of peer review that we are probably most accustomed to are single-blind peer review and double-blind. In single-blind peer review, usually the authors are known to the reviewers, but the reviewers remain anonymous. And one of the reasons that a journal might adopt a single-blind peer review format is because it requires less pre-processing. For double-blind, where the authors are also unknown to the reviewers, this frequently requires that you have to make some modifications to the manuscript, where you have to de-identify or remove any hint of identity in the manuscript. So in addition to removing the author names and affiliations, you may have to remove references at the end that might otherwise identify who the authors are. Now, double-blind peer review, that's really considered to be the gold standard. There's technically also triple-blind peer review, but I think very few journals rely on that. And in this case, both authors and reviewers don't know each other's identities. And the intent of this is to ensure that we have a level playing field and that this then reduces bias in the review process. Because if you are a reviewer and you know who the authors are, and you say, oh yeah, that's my friend, yeah, I'll go easy on them. Or I really disagree with that person's research agenda, so I'm really gonna nail them. And then as an author, if you get a negative review and you know who the reviewers are, then you're going to say, oh boy, I'm going to get that person back for being negative to me. That was really unfair. So, by keeping everything anonymous, then this is supposed to reduce bias. Okay, so now then, if this system works, and we've been using it for generations, why do we need to change this? And why would we need open peer review? Well, for one thing, it's going to be more transparent. If there is no anonymity for authors and reviewers, they have to stand behind their work. They don't have anonymity to hide behind. And it sort of raises the question, if you are a reviewer and you're anonymous, does that encourage you to be more negative? Potentially, because, well, they won't know who I am. It also encourages more accountability, because it means that as a reviewer, you have to stand behind your work. Knowing that your name is going to appear alongside your review, you want to make sure that you've provided a thorough and fair assessment of the manuscript you have reviewed. And you don't have then an anonymity to hide behind. And if people are going to review your work or see what you have written as part of your review, you want to make sure that it looks rigorous. Because like all of us have probably encountered a review in our careers where we got, one line of comment. This is okay, or this needs some work. And it's like, okay, and what else can you tell me about how can we improve this? And encouraging reviewers to then sign their reviews means then that is less likely to happen. It also means that as an author, you are probably going to be more careful with your submission. As a reviewer, one thing I don't like getting are half-baked manuscripts where it's clear that the authors are hoping, well, they'll tell us what's wrong with it and then we'll fix it. So as an author then, if you know that the reviews of your work are going to appear alongside the publication, you want to make sure that you've submitted the best possible work so that you get, the least negative review possible. A third rationale for open peer review is that it acknowledges the reviewer's hidden work. As an academic, as a researcher, we engage in a lot of peer review, but this is frequently considered hidden work for us because your reviews aren't published in a standard blind peer review format. And by publishing the reviews, that then provides you with an acknowledgement, or it gives you credit for that work. And a good example of this is Publons, if you're not familiar with it. It allows reviewers to get credit for the reviews that they have conducted. And potentially the reviews are also made available through Publons. And a fourth reason why you might want to consider OPR is that it provides exemplars for new reviewers. As a researcher, we normally don't have any formal training in how to be a good reviewer. It's just something you learn through apprenticeship. You learn through the process of receiving your own reviews. Maybe early in your career, you have an opportunity to review for journals, and you sort of learn by trial and error. And that's not really the best way to become a good reviewer. But if you get to see how other people review papers, especially experienced reviewers, that can then provide some really good insights for you on how you can approach your own review process. But there are some downsides to OPR. It's more work for publishers. If you're going to publish the reviews alongside the papers, then it's an extra document that gets published alongside the final paper. Okay, so if double-blind peer review is supposed to reduce the amount of bias that you encounter in reviews, is it possible that using OPR increases the bias? Okay, as a reviewer, are you going to be influenced by author identities? Okay, so you are a young researcher just trying to establish a name for yourself, and you're reviewing somebody who's a very big name in the field. Can that be intimidating for you? Are you then less likely to be negative if you disagree with that person? And that means then that as a reviewer, you may change the tone of your review because, well, if they know who you are, then are you going to use more hedging terms, for example? Or are you going to tone down your criticism? That may or may not be a good thing. If criticism is warranted and it's done in a constructive way, then there shouldn't be any issue with that. And another possible downside is that it can create confusion if you have multiple preprint versions of a manuscript that appear alongside the reviews. And there are some examples of journals that will do this, where as a manuscript is going through several rounds of reviews, the manuscript then appears on the website of the journal. And so you may get intermediate versions that people are already citing. Okay, what are some examples of journals that support OPR? Here are just three very quick examples. Actually, these are publishers. BMC Central is actually one of the pioneers in this area. They have been supporting forms of OPR for a good 20 years or so. And with BMC Central, a number of their journals, they will provide the reviews alongside the publications, and reviewers have the option of identifying themselves. F1000 Research is the most liberal example of OPR that exists out there. Even before a manuscript is officially accepted, the submitted version of the manuscript appears on the journal's website. You will see who the reviewers are for the manuscript. You will see the reviews, and you will see subsequent versions of the manuscript as it continues to go through the review process. And then once it receives at least 2 positive acceptances, then the research is considered published. Now, as a third example or model, Frontiers Media. A number of Frontiers journals you might be familiar with, as Sam mentioned. I am editor for a section of Frontiers in Research Metrics and Analytics. And Frontiers uses a more limited form of OPR. It will not publish the reviews alongside the papers, but it will publish the names of the reviewers of that paper. So at least the reviewers then can claim credit. Okay, so now let me move on to some relevant studies here. I'll be talking about 3 studies that I've been involved with my colleague Pei-Ling Wang, who is a faculty member at the University of Tennessee, and some of our doctoral students. One of our first studies looked at review characteristics, and this was published just over 5 years ago now. And this is where we investigated the open peer review characteristics of an open access journal called PeerJ. And they also use a fairly liberal form of OPR, where authors and reviewers have the options of making reviews and identities available. So as an author, you can choose to make your review available. As a reviewer, you can choose to identify yourself or not. And what we found is that, well, most authors were interested in making the reviews available, which I think is a positive thing. But as a reviewer, I think they were a bit more shy about identifying themselves. So fewer than half were willing to identify who they were. So for the data set that we looked at, which covered several years of reviews published in this journal, unsigned reviews were much more common than the signed reviews. And one thing we looked at was if you signed your review or you chose to remain anonymous, did that affect the length of the review? And we found that it made no significant difference. Although the length of the review tells us nothing about what the content of the review is and the quality of the review. So as an example of how PeerJ applies this idea of peer review. So if you go to an article in PeerJ and you look to the right, there's going to be a box that says peer review history. And when you click on that, you will come up with a screen that looks like this. And what you will see then is the version indication, and then there will be some comments from the managing editor. And then you'll get comments from from the reviewers who may or may not have identified themselves. A more recent study that we looked at took a look at the review characteristics. So instead of just the length of the reviews, we wanted to look at the actual content of the reviews. And this is something that just came out about less than a year ago in the journal Research Evaluation. And what we did was we looked at the review characteristics of 17 OPR journals. And what we were interested in seeing is what sort of vocabulary were the reviewers using in their reviews, and did this vary whether they identified themselves or not. So we were particularly interested in the use of hedging terms and research-related terms in the reviews. And unfortunately, it's with OPR, the only reviews that you have access to are the ones that have been made public. We don't have access to the reviews that reviewers decided they didn't want their reviews to be made public, or the authors chose not to do so. So all we could do was really review the content of journals where reviewer identities were required or optional. And for things like hedging terms, what we were looking for were terms like, perhaps, I believe the authors do this, it seems like the author intended this, maybe the authors should try this. And for research terms, where they're referring to specific aspects of the research, whether it's an experiment, hypothesis, statistic, research question, and so on. What we found is that there was no notable difference really in the relative use of hedging terms. So if authors were required to identify themselves or it was optional, it didn't affect their use of hedging. And that's something that I think is of concern when you're in an OPR environment where reviewers might pull their punches or try to be less critical. But we found that wasn't really the case, at least in terms of hedging vocabulary used. What we did find was that there was greater relative use of different types of research terms in the reviews when there were required identities. And we didn't run a statistical test on this because we're talking about a relatively small sample size. But where the author identities or the reviewer identities were required for the 11 journals, we found that the relative use of research terms was higher than for the journals where the reviewer identity was optional. I think this is something that warrants further investigation in the future, but we thought that was an interesting finding. Now, the third study that we conducted, and this came out in the journal Scientometrics in 2020, one thing that we had noticed in the literature is that there had never really been a comprehensive review of OPR journals. How prevalent is the use of OPR and what types of models are being adopted? And so we tried to conduct a very comprehensive study where we scoured the internet, we looked at different websites, we tried to identify all the publishers and journals that use different forms of OPR. And we were able to identify at this point, and this covers up to late 2019, 617 OPR journals. And we wanted to determine in which disciplines OPR was most prevalent. And what we found is that in medical and health sciences and in the natural sciences that we see the vast majority of OPR journals. It is becoming more common in the social sciences. It's still relatively uncommon in the humanities. But when you look at this graph and you see the relative growth, you can see in the last few years it's really taken off. Although clearly 617 journals is still just a drop in the bucket when compared to all the different journals that exist out there. We were also interested in looking at the levels of openness and whether identities in reports were required or optional. And what we found is that for open reports decided by the author and open identities decided by the reviewer, that is where it's optional by both, that was actually one of the most common aspects that we saw, or the most common approaches that were used. Second most common was the idea where both were mandated or required. So where reviewers were required to identify themselves, authors were required to make the reviews available. And then there was a mixture of different things where open reports could be required, but then reviewers remained anonymous. And it'll be interesting to see as we get more and more OPR journals, how the journals decide to pursue this option. It seems like having optional identities and optional review availability is one of the main approaches. From this, we developed a process product approach to OPR where we tried to categorize what the different options are. So in terms of process, where the reviewer identity is known and where reviewer reports are available, there are different options out there where it's the journal's mandate or it's optional. And if it's optional, does the author and the reviewer both have a choice? And at what point in time? Is it at submission or upon review invitation? We also have the product aspect of it. So what is in the open reviews? Is it the reviewer names? Is it the full reports? Or could it be a decision letter? So we noticed there was at least one journal out there where they wouldn't publish the full reviews, but they would publish a summary report. And then where the open reviews are stored. Are they alongside the paper? It could be in a year-end issue for print journals, or it could be in a scholarly archive. So there are many different approaches to this idea of OPR. Okay, and that brings me up to data sharing, reuse, and citation. And before I get into some of the studies that I've been involved with here, let's talk a bit about what is considered research data. And this idea is actually broader than probably what many people would think of initially. So it's really any factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. Okay, and this was from an official source. But data sets, that's something that would be obvious to us. But when we're talking about mathematical data, textual data, yes, that's something that we can really envision. But a data set could also be something from the physical world. It could be a core sample for geologists. It could be an ice sample taken from Antarctica. It could be images. It could be X-rays in a medical study or CT scans. It could be tissue samples used in biomedical research or genetic material or genetic code. We can consider software to be a form of research data and people's field notes as well. So these are just some of the many different examples of research data that could exist out there. Data sharing and reuse has become much more common, especially in the sciences, because these represent valuable resources that can see future use for different purposes. But there are challenges to this that we've been experiencing so far. There's the scalability of making data available and the granularity of how we provide that access. We need the infrastructure to be able to make that data available. And there are the dynamics, like when we talk about data that's publicly available, is it static? Are there frequent updates? And if that's the case, do we have to reference it at a given point in time and make sure that that is reflected in what we're reporting? Then we talk about like qualitative data sharing and reuse. Well, when we're talking about interview transcripts, is that something that should be made publicly available? If you're talking about personal information, you also have to consider users' privacy. As I mentioned earlier, there are now federal funding mandates, and many high-profile journals are requiring that authors share their data. And there are a growing number of data repositories out there. These could be institutional repositories. Harvard has a good example, Michigan's ICPSR, UIUC, Illinois Data Bank, and we have government-sponsored repositories. NIH has its own. You could be relying on other more general sources like Zenodo, Figshare. So there are many examples of where data can be made public. Now, this gets us into this idea of data citation. So when we're sharing and reusing data, we should really provide appropriate attribution. And one of the reasons why researchers may be at least hesitant to share data initially is that if they're not done using it and they make it available, future findings could be scooped from under them. And so there's some reluctance with sharing data because you want to get as much out of it as you can before you make it available. We also need data citation, and data citation can help in this regard because if you are going to be reusing a data set, you want to give credit to those who have made the data available. And right now there is insufficient credit to those data authors. It also then provides really an evidence trail so that when you conduct research that you can go back and identify where the data came from. And from an accountability and transparency perspective, that is also important. There are some data citation sources out there if you're not familiar with them. Clarivate, which produces the Web of Science, for the past 10 years or so, they have produced the Data Citation Index. And this is a source that provides access to citations from data sets that appear in probably at least 500 different data repositories out there. And DataCite is an example of another source that provides some of this type of information, although it's not as easily searchable as something like the DCI. Okay, so why is data citation important? We are accustomed to citing bibliographic sources in our research because they provide the foundation on which we conduct our research. But we don't necessarily do that for the data sets that we use. And we've got a number of sources that already deal with bibliographic citation, Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar. And for data, though, we don't have as many options. So, there are some journals that will require that you cite data. So, for example, EP1000 indicates that if you're using a data source, please use formal citation. The issue with data citation, though, is that there's inconsistent practice. Many researchers don't know that they're supposed to be citing data, and they don't know the process of doing that. And that then results in invisible citations, where the developers of the data sets aren't receiving appropriate attribution. And well, there is also concern with courtesy authorship, but we won't get into that. What research studies on data citation have shown is that there is roughly almost a 70% increase in bibliographic citations when descriptions of the data are shared. And that goes back more than 15 years. And that informal data citation is more widely found than formal data citation and sharing. So I will briefly talk about 4 studies in which I've been involved with my former doctoral student, Hongju Park, who graduated a few years ago. And her dissertation looked at aspects of data citation. Now I see I'm quickly running out of time here, so I will try to go through this fairly efficiently. Okay, so with a focus on data citation, what we found is that, yes, informal data citation is much more common than formal citation, and that it's much more common in biomedical fields. So, and the only way that we were able to really study this is we had to go through the full text of articles to determine where references were made to data sets, because the idea of formal data citation isn't as widely adopted at this point. So authors are more likely to informally cite data sets outside of the references. So the way we gather citations for our bibliographic works is in the reference section that sources like Scopus and Web of Science then index. But if a citation to a data set is buried in the middle of a research paper, that's not going to be picked up by an indexing source. Other findings that we found is that self-citation is somewhat common. So once we make our data sets available, we tend to cite ourselves, or we tend to go back to those data sets and give ourselves a citation. And formal software citation is even more rare than other forms of data citation. Okay, so what's an example of a formal citation? And I'm sorry, I didn't, I should have enabled the laser pointer on here, but okay, under example of formal citation, you can see where it looks similar to a bibliographic citation. But some examples of informal citation would be where it's buried within the main text, or it could appear towards the end under web resources that are used that may or may not be picked up by a citation indexing service. So what we found from this research is that we came up with some recommendations for best practices, both general recommendations and those for authors. So one thing that we definitely need is a standardized approach for citation. Okay, and there are some efforts out there. DataCite, for example, W3C have also come up with some suggestions for how we should be citing data. We definitely need some metadata there, and there needs to be some specific fields that are included as part of that metadata. And the existing data citation sources, like the data citation index, need to be more comprehensive. Right now, they are limited to specific data repositories. And if you have placed your data in a non-index source, then you're not going to get that credit. There's also the granularity of the sources. You could be citing more than, there could be a data group within a data repository that consists of a number of different data sets. Do you cite the individual data set, or do you cite the repository of that data? There are also best practices for stakeholders. As an author, you need to be encouraged to share your data and rely on those repositories that are indexed by citation databases. And definitely use repositories that provide DOIs. Zenodo is a good example of that. Once you have a DOI, then that is a very precise way that your data set can be located. Authors also need to be familiar with data citation practices. So formally cite data sources you use in the reference section and not just in passing. And we also need to encourage journals to encourage their authors to cite data sources. So there should be a policy in the journal when authors look at the submission requirements that there be reference made to data citation. Okay, so wrapping up quickly then, what are some of the implications of these different aspects of open science for areas of our field, like resource discovery and access? Well, what began as a single document, the final publication, what we find now is that there are many potential documents that are now associated with that one piece of research. We could have open notes. We can have open data. There could be software associated with it. And then we have one or more peer review reports that are linked to one or more versions of those final publications. So when you think of what the challenges, the challenges that might exist for things like representation and data and discovery, well, there's the potential for new ways to discover those research products because you have all these new access points. But then is there also the potential to introduce noise where all you want is the published paper and it takes you to one of the review reports, which then hopefully takes you to the final paper, but there definitely has to be a connection between the review and the paper in order for that to happen. Okay, so future areas for investigation. Looking at what sort of methods can be used to best represent and find data sets, and what is the most effective level of granularity. So do you want to do it at the individual data set level, the individual record, the data point? Some things are more feasible than others. The question still arises when you have more documentary sources that are related to a given research product, whether it's the data set, the open notes, the reviews, is that going to result in more successful access points to those research products? And if we formalize these different ways, with peer reviews, if we identify what are the hallmarks of exemplary peer reviews, the application of things like reporting standards, which are common in biomedical fields. So for experimental studies, you have guidelines that have been developed saying that an experimental study must contain A, B, C, and D. That can help reviewers. That can also help automated peer review systems. So, and as I was mentioning to Sam earlier, if you can incorporate AI components that can either assist reviewers in making sure that the review is comprehensive, it can also assist authors in making sure that the reports that they submit, the manuscripts, meet all of the requirements in terms of report content. So there are some really nice opportunities here for future research that await investigation. And I see I am pretty well out of time right now, and I apologize. I went a few minutes over. I wanted to allow at least 15 minutes for questions. So thank you very much. I will be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Wolfram. It was awesome, and I'm going to try and monitor the Zoom chat for incoming questions, but I'll have to do it while at the same time asking my own questions because I could easily eat the entire 10 minutes with questions I have. So you guys, if you have questions, get them in now before I just hog it all. Can I start immediately with one question, right? Which is that going back to the open kind of review model, right, where there's disclosure on both ends. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, it's a little bit outside the scope of what you were kind of presenting, but I think it's critical in that because that is so different than the kind of the gold standard that everyone is so comfortable and used to. Anecdotally, I have found a huge amount of resistance to the concept and the idea. And I'm curious if you, in your research or plans for research, have you run into that? And is there ways like you're addressing it? For example, like maybe is it that people who go through this experience, do they seek out journals that do it? Like, do they want to repeat the open review kind of process? Is it a matter of citing reviews? I'm just curious about this long-term sustainability and disbursement of it. Your thoughts and ideas about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For journals that require reviewers to identify themselves, that can be a bit of a drawback because when you are looking for reviewers to review manuscripts and you're as a potential reviewer, you're being told, oh, and by the way, you have to identify yourself. That immediately might turn off 50% of the potential research reviewer pool. So then what do you do? And I think what some journals have discovered is, well, let's make it optional. And as reviewers, then they have the choice of whether they identify themselves. And maybe as this becomes more mainstream, which is the hope, I guess, as a reviewer, you become more accustomed to the idea of making your identity available, and this becomes less of an issue. For authors, yeah, again, it's the same idea. There may be some authors who say, well, I don't want my reviews to be made available. Like, I don't want to air my dirty laundry about, the different, the many versions of my paper that I had to go through in order to get this accepted. But yeah, make it optional for them as well. And so that is the approach that a journal like PeerJ has taken. Give both authors and reviewers the choice. But then you've got other journals like F1000 Research that say, nope, everything has to be open in the interests of transparency. You have to make your reviews available. And as reviewers, you have to identify yourself. This is still a new idea for many folks. And research has found that in principle, researchers are in favor of the idea of OPR. They just, they just don't necessarily want to follow all of the best practices or the features of OPR. So yes, as a reviewer, reviews should be made available, but I don't want to have to identify myself.
Sure, I'm in favor of everyone getting free money, just as long as I get more money than everybody else,
Yeah.
right? So, all right, that's a joke, everyone. Okay, Professor Sorel wanted, I guess, is asking for a comment on difficulties in data reuse, and maybe if is that are you talking, Dagobert? Are you talking about kind of the the social science psychology replication crisis or something different?
Well, just making data available as they were collected does not make them reusable.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to do. There's a lot of data cleaning, anonymization. The theoretical framework of the data collection correspond to what the reuser wants to do. And just another sort of informal comment, and this is just what I heard with the grapevine. If NIH cuts the budget of a grant submission, the first thing to go is money for cleaning up the data to make them truly reusable.
Yep.
So even from funding agencies, you have a lip service, but not really reuse. And that's a big mountain still to climb.
Yeah, and that's actually a very good point, that as a researcher, in addition to publishing papers, you're now expected to publish your data set. And in order for it to be usable, yeah, you have to clean it up. You have to provide the appropriate metadata. You have to put it in a format that others can use and that they can understand. And that's extra time. And if you're not getting credit for that in the form of data citation, what is your motivation as an author to go through that extra effort if there is no incentive for it? And that actually represents another incentive for data citation practices. So those that do go to the trouble of providing their data sets, making them usable, and therefore they will be reused, are going to be rewarded with additional citations. Now, whether that's enough incentive, I don't know.
And if like tenure cases and other kind of high stakes assessments count those citations as the same as other kind of submissions.
Well, yeah, and you look at, okay, do data sets go through the same form of peer review that journal articles do? In some cases they do. There are data journals out there that the articles essentially are descriptions of the data sets. They have gone through a peer review process. So that is one way to ensure that your data set gets recognized, that authors then who use your data set will cite that article.
I think we have time. Yeah, no, this is, sorry, I'm so excited about the other question. Scott, I think we have time. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, just being a little bit of a contrarian, my question was, do you see any conditions under which reviewers should be paid for their reviews? I mean, we're providing a lot of free labor for journals. In our current culture, everybody seems to want to be paid for everything they do. I mean, obviously, if you're working for a public university, you could make a argument that the products of your labor should be open and free to all. But I also just wonder whether we should be paid for reviews, and in some ways more broadly for the knowledge we generate. I mean, again, from a more capitalist point of view, we're being dupes in some ways because we're generating all this knowledge that someone may potentially down the road apply in some kind of technology that makes money. So I'm just curious on your perspective on this.
Yeah, I guess that I know that's been a long-standing argument, and as a reviewer or as an editor of a journal, the work that we provide to publishers who make money hand over fist when it comes to the journals and how much they charge, and a lot of that labor comes from the research community, which they do not get paid for, but hopefully at least they get acknowledgements for, which then gets them their 2% increase at the end of the year when they submit their brag sheets. Whether that makes up for, not getting paid for all that work explicitly, I don't know. But I think there might be some concern that if you start making this, if you start providing a monetary incentive, does the quality then suffer? Where if I do 60 reviews this year, that's going to get me X dollars. Yeah, that's in my, and then, how many reviews can I get done this week? And
well, I mean, but that's an issue that, say, for example, physicians, healthcare workers have. How many people can I run through the office, and why you may be sitting there for an hour or two each day because they've scheduled multiple folks. I don't know. I just think in some circumstances being paid might increase the quality of the work. But again, I go both ways on this, so that's why I was interested in your perspective.
I feel the same way. I can see pluses and minuses for that approach. It's at the very minimum, we need to be recognized for that work that we do, and it's still largely hidden. Publication of reviews is one way. Data citation for getting credit for making that data available. Why do we do what we do? And I like assigning. You may be familiar with a book from the 1980s by Latour and Woolgar that deals with the process of science and what scientists do. And one chapter I assign to my introductory doctoral seminar each year deals with cycles of credit and why scientists do what they do. And it turns out that the idea of citation, it's bean counting to some extent, but if you look at it more broadly, the credibility that it gets you, the more citations you accrue, the more credibility you get, the more likely you are to get grants, which then gets you more publications, which gets you more citations. And so in a sense, the idea of like a citation becomes a form of currency. And even though it's not a physical dollar amount, it does provide its own, I guess, intellectual reward. I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, I'm wondering if universities themselves could not recognize reviewer work as, as something that their scholars do and are asked to do, and acknowledge that as more scholarly activity, including it in their research as part of their research agenda, that kind of thing. I mean, start small rather than having the journal, pay you, have your individual university recognize your scholarship by doing this academic service.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, when do you include this on your annual reviews? And if you do you include it under research or service? I tend to include it under service, yeah.
Under service.
Yeah. We unfortunately were at 1 o'clock, and clearly, Dietmar, you could probably give us another hour and we could
Oh.
talk for as long. But I want to please everyone, please join me in thanking him for what is clearly an awesome talk.
Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the invitation. I greatly appreciate your interest in this work and your questions. So it's something that affects us in the information professionals directly or indirectly, as researchers, as librarians who are involved with this process. Yeah, and like I said, there's still work for us to do in this. Even though we have these ideas, these ideals, they haven't all been implemented yet. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
You
care.
can probably stop recording, Heidi, if you want, or